It was whispered throughout Stone Creek Valley that when Jackson Blackwell made up his mind, even God himself would think twice before standing in his way. His ranch, the Raven's Crest, was a kingdom unto itself, 15,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, where fortunes were made and broken on the strength of a man's word. But even the mightiest of men can't outrun their promises, and Jackson Blackwell had made one that would change his son's life forever. This is the story of Thomas Blackwell, heir to a cattle empire built on grit and sacrifice, and the mysterious woman who would either be his salvation or his undoing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1892 hung heavy over Montana territory. Heat shimmered off the distant mountains like spirits dancing across the horizon, and the land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the mercy of rain. At Raven's Crest Ranch, dust clung to everything. Boots, fences, even the very airmen breathed. Thomas Blackwell wiped sweat from his brow as he dismounted his chestnut stallion. At 32, he had his father's height and his mother's eyes, but none of his father's ruthless certainty. He'd spent his life learning every inch of this ranch, every blade of grass, every head of cattle. He knew which streams ran dry in August and which pastures yielded the sweetest grass. What he didn't know was how to say no to Jackson Blackwell. Main House stood like a sentinel against the vast expanse of sky. 2 stories of weathered timber and stone that had withstood blizzards, drought, and the passage of time. Inside, the walls were adorned with mounted antlers and faded photographs, silent witnesses to 3 generations of Blackwell men who had carved their legacy from untamed wilderness. Thomas found his father in the study, a room that smelled of leather, tobacco, and power. Jackson Blackwell didn't look up from the ledger before him when his son entered. At 65, he remained as formidable as the mountains themselves. Silver hair cropped short, shoulders unbowed by age, hands calloused from work he could have delegated decades ago, but chose not to. "You wanted to see me," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Jackson finally looked up, blue eyes sharp as winter ice. "Judge Sullivan's will was read yesterday." Thomas remained silent. Judge Sullivan had been his father's oldest friend, confidant, and occasional rival. His death last month had been sudden, a heart attack during Sunday dinner. "I made him a promise 15 years ago," Jackson continued, closing the ledger with deliberate care. "One that concerns you." "What kind of promise?" Thomas asked, tension gathering between his shoulders. Jackson reached into his desk drawer and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age. "When Matthew Sullivan lost his wife to fever, I swore to him that his daughter would never want protection or prosperity." "Rebecca," Thomas frowned. "She left Stone Creek nearly a decade ago, went east for schooling, and now she's coming home." Jackson slid the envelope across the polished oak surface. "Without family, without means." Thomas made no move to take it. "What does this have to do with me?" "You're going to marry her. Next Sunday." The words landed like a physical blow. Thomas stared at his father, searching for any sign of humor or uncertainty. There was none. "Marry Rebecca Sullivan? A woman I haven't seen since she was 17? A woman no one's seen in years?" Thomas's voice remained steady, but his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "I gave my word," Jackson said simply, as if that explained everything. "In his world, perhaps it did. Your word, not mine." Thomas paced to the window, staring out at the land that was his birthright and his burden. "I don't even know what she looks like anymore. Doesn't matter what she looks like. What matters is that Blackwell keeps his promises." Thomas turned, anger flaring. "So I'm just another asset to be traded? Another head of cattle to be branded with the family mark?" Jackson's expression hardened. "You're my son, and you'll do what's necessary for this family and this land. What if I refuse?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous as a lit fuse. Jackson Blackwell rose slowly from his chair, his shadow stretching across the room. "Then you're not the man I raised you to be." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And you're not the man who should inherit Raven's crest." There it was, the ultimatum Thomas had always known would come. The ranch or his freedom, his heritage or his heart. "She arrives on tomorrow's train," Jackson said, his tone softening marginally. "I've already sent word to Pastor Miller. The wedding will be small, dignified. And if she refuses?" Jackson's laugh was short, without humor. "She won't. Judge Sullivan may have had money once, but he lost nearly everything in that mining venture 5 years back. That fancy Eastern education left his daughter with refined tastes and empty pockets. She needs this as much as we do." "We?" Thomas challenged. "What does this family gain from me marrying a penniless woman?" "The Sullivan water rights." Jackson tapped the envelope. "Matthew signed them over to me years ago, but they reverted to Rebecca upon her 25th birthday, which was last month. With those rights and our existing claims, we'll control every drop of water from the Eastern Ridge to Cottonwood Creek. No rancher for 50 miles would be able to move without our say-so." Thomas finally took the envelope, not bothering to open it. The details hardly mattered now. "So this is a business arrangement. Most marriages are, son. Your mother and I barely knew each other when we wed." Jackson returned to his chair. "She grew to love me, and I like her. This isn't 1860 anymore. The principles haven't changed. You'll provide for her, protect her. In return, she'll run your household, bear your children, and be a proper Blackwell. Wife." Jackson dipped his pen in ink, returning to his ledger. "The matter's decided." Thomas stood there a moment longer, the envelope crushed in his grip, before turning to leave. "One more thing," Jackson called after him. "I haven't seen Rebecca since she left, but Martha Sullivan wrote to me last year before she passed. Said the girl had an accident at school, something with a fire, left her face marked. Said she's taken to wearing veils in public." Thomas paused at the doorway. "You're forcing me to marry a woman I don't know, don't love, and now you tell me she's disfigured." "I'm telling you not to judge what you see too quickly." Jackson didn't look up. "Beauty fades, land endures." Outside, the afternoon had begun its slow surrender to evening. Thomas walked past the stables, past the bunkhouse where ranch hands played cards and swapped stories, past the boundaries of what he'd always known. His thoughts churned like storm clouds. Rebecca Sullivan. They'd been childhood acquaintances at best. She'd been a quiet girl, always with a book, always watching. He remembered dark hair and serious eyes, a child who seemed old before her time. Now she was returning, changed by education and accident, to be his wife. Thomas reached the Eastern Ridge just as sunset painted the sky in violent shades of orange and red. Below him stretched the Raven's crest in all its glory, cattle grazing in the valley, the silver ribbon of Stillwater Creek winding through willow breaks, the distant smoke from cook fires as ranch hands prepared their evening meal. All of it would be his one day. All of it depends on his acceptance of a bride chosen for water rights and old promises. He thought of leaving, packing a bag, saddling his horse, riding until Montana was just a memory. He'd done it once before. Spent 6 months working cattle drives in Wyoming after his mother died. But the land had called him back then, its pull stronger than grief or anger, or the sweet taste of freedom. As darkness claimed the valley, Thomas made his decision. He would meet Rebecca Sullivan. He would honor his father's word, if not his own desires. He would marry a stranger and hope that duty might somehow transform into something more. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that Rebecca Sullivan had made decisions of her own during those years away. That beneath her veil lay more than scars. That sometimes the most valuable things in life arrive disguised as obligations we never wanted to bear. The train from Bozeman was scheduled to arrive at noon the following day. Thomas spent the morning in a strange state of calm resignation, overseeing the branding of spring calves, giving instructions to the foreman about rotating the herd to fresher pasture. If the ranch hands noticed anything unusual in his manner, they were wise enough not to mention it. At 11:30, he returned to the main house, bathed and dressed in his best suit, charcoal gray with a black string tie. He didn't bother with flowers or gifts. This wasn't a courtship, it was a transaction. The Stone Creek train station was little more than a wooden platform and a telegraph office, but today it seemed to Thomas like the threshold to another life. He stood apart from the small crowd, hat in hand, watching the approach of black smoke on the horizon. With a screech of metal and a blast of steam, the locomotive arrived, disgorging a handful of passengers into the midday heat. Thomas scanned the newcomers, a drummer with sample cases, an elderly couple, a young man in a city suit. And then he saw her. She stepped down carefully, one gloved hand on the conductor's arm. She wore a traveling suit of deep blue, high-necked and tailored to her slender frame. A matching hat sat atop carefully arranged dark hair, and from it hung a fine mesh veil that obscured her features entirely. Thomas approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome, knowing only that from this moment forward his life would never be the same. "Miss Sullivan," he said, stopping before her. "I'm Thomas Blackwell. Welcome back to Stone Creek." Rebecca Sullivan stood perfectly still, like a painting, uncoming to life. The veil obscured her face completely, showing only the vague outline of her features. For a moment, neither spoke, the busy platform dissolving into background noise around them. "Mr. Blackwell," she finally said, her voice unexpectedly melodic, with the refined accent of Eastern schooling layered over Montana roots. "How kind of you to meet me personally." Thomas cleared his throat. "I thought it appropriate considering the circumstances." "Yes," she replied, "the circumstances." She adjusted her gloves, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both nervousness and determination. "I presume your father explained everything?" He did. Thomas reached for her single trunk, hefting it easily. "My buggy's this way, if you're ready." They walked in silence through Stone Creek's main street, past the general store, where old men played checkers and tracked newcomers with curious eyes, past the saloon where piano music spilled into the dusty street, past the millinery where two women paused their shopping to whisper behind raised hands. Thomas helped Rebecca into the buggy, careful not to touch her more than necessary. As they pulled away from town, he found himself stealing glances at her veiled profile, trying to reconcile this composed woman with the shy girl he vaguely remembered. "You must have questions," Rebecca said suddenly, her hands folded primly in her lap. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "Many, but they can wait if you prefer." "I'd rather know what I'm facing, Mr. Blackwell." "Thomas," he corrected. "If we're to be married in 3 days, you might as well use my given name." She nodded slightly. "Thomas, then, and I'm Rebecca." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The buggy crested a hill, revealing the spread of Raven's Crest Ranch below them. The sprawling main house, the cluster of outbuildings, the vast expanse of grazing land stretching toward the mountains. "It's even more impressive than I remembered," Rebecca said quietly. "It's a working ranch," Thomas replied. "Not as refined as what you might be accustomed to back east." "I wasn't raised in a palace, Thomas. I remember mud and cattle well enough." The slight edge in her voice surprised him. Perhaps she wasn't as acquiescent as his father had implied. "Your father indicated there was some kind of accident," he said, immediately regretting the bluntness of his words. "That's why you wear the veil." Rebecca turned toward him, and though he couldn't see her expression, he felt the weight of her gaze. "Yes, A laboratory fire at the women's college I attended. I was studying chemistry. Chemistry? Thomas couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. I wouldn't have expected a woman to pursue such a subject. Her tone was cool but not angry, or a judge's daughter, either, I suppose. She turned back to the view. I found that expectations are rarely useful things, Thomas. They limit what we see, what we believe is possible. As they approached the ranch house, ranch hands paused in their work to stare openly at the veiled woman beside their boss's son. News traveled fast in ranch country. Everyone knew about the impending marriage, though few understood its purpose. Thomas helped Rebecca down from the buggy, then carried her trunk inside. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper who had served the Blackwell family for 20 years, greeted them in the foyer with obvious curiosity. Miss Sullivan, welcome to Raven's Crest. I've prepared the blue room for you until the wedding. Thank you, Mrs. Winters, Rebecca replied with gracious warmth. I remember you from when I was a child. You always had peppermint sticks in your apron pocket. The older woman's face softened with surprise and pleasure. Indeed I did, for good little girls who said their please and thank yous. Which I hope I still do, Rebecca said with what sounded like a smile in her voice. Thomas watched this exchange with interest. Rebecca's charm was evident even through the barrier of her veil. He wondered what other qualities she might possess that weren't immediately apparent. I'll show you to your room, he said, gesturing toward the stairs. The blue room was at the east end of the second floor, spacious, with tall windows overlooking the ranch yard and distant pastures. The furniture was solid oak, polished to a soft glow by generations of careful hands. Fresh wildflowers stood in a ceramic vase on the dresser, Mrs. Winter's thoughtful touch. I hope you'll be comfortable here, Thomas said, setting down her trunk. Supper is at 6. My father will be joining us. Rebecca moved to the window, her silhouette outlined against the afternoon light. It's strange, returning as an adult to places you knew as a child. Everything seems both smaller and more significant. Thomas lingered at the doorway, unexpectedly reluctant to leave. Rebecca, about this marriage, please, she interrupted quietly. Not yet. Let me at least catch my breath before we discuss our mutual sentence. Her choice of words stung more than he would have expected. As you wish. I'll leave you to rest. He closed the door behind him, standing in the hallway for a moment with an odd sense of having missed something important. Then he headed downstairs, where ranch business awaited. Predictable problems with clear solutions, unlike the woman behind the blue door. Supper that evening was a tense affair. Jackson Blackwell dominated the conversation, outlining his plans for expanding the ranch's operations, asking Rebecca pointed questions about her father's estate and the water rights now in her possession. If he noticed her reluctance to speak of such matters, he gave no indication. The deed transfer will be handled after the ceremony, he said, cutting into his steak with precision. Simple enough, since you're to be family. I understand the business aspects of our arrangement, Mr. Blackwell, Rebecca replied coolly. Throughout the meal, she had managed to eat without fully removing her veil, lifting it just enough to allow small bites and sips. Though I confess, I'm curious why you didn't simply purchase the water rights outright when my father was in financial difficulty. Jackson's knife paused midway through the meat. Matthew Sullivan was a proud man. He wouldn't take charity, but he would accept an alliance between our families. He glanced at Thomas. Besides, my son is 32. High time he settled down. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his jaw tightened. I believe I can speak for myself, Father. Then perhaps you should do so more often. Jackson wiped his mouth with his napkin. Rebecca deserves to know what kind of man she's marrying. Rebecca set down her fork carefully. With respect, Mr. Blackwell, I believe I'll discover that for myself. A heavy silence descended on the dining room. Thomas found himself studying Rebecca with new interest, despite her circumstances, penniless, disfigured, bound by her late father's arrangements. She maintained a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Later that night, Thomas stood on the porch, watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. The air smelled of rain and sage, a scent he'd known all his life. He heard the soft creak of the door behind him and turned to find Rebecca approaching, still veiled, despite the late hour and privacy of the porch. "May I join you?" she asked. "Of course." He moved aside, making room at the railing. She stood beside him, looking out at the darkening landscape. "Your father is exactly as I remembered him." Thomas gave a short laugh. "Unyielding as granite." "Determined," she corrected. "And absolutely certain he knows what's best for everyone." "That's a charitable interpretation." "Perhaps." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Or perhaps I simply understand that difficult men are often shaped by difficult circumstances." Thomas glanced at her, wishing he could see her expression. "You're very forgiving of a man who's essentially bartered for your hand, just as you're very obedient to a father who's done the same to you." The words carried no judgment, only observation. "We all make compromises, Thomas." Lightning flashed in the distance, briefly illuminating the world in stark relief. Thunder followed seconds later. "Will you tell me what happened?" Thomas asked quietly. With the fire, Rebecca was silent for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she sighed, a soft sound nearly lost in the night breeze. "I was working late in the laboratory, an experiment with phosphorus compounds." Her voice was steady, detached, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. "A flask shattered. The chemical ignited instantly. My sleeve caught fire, then my hair." Thomas winced, imagining her terror. "Another student saved my life," she continued, "threw me to the ground, smothered the flames with her own coat, but not before—" Her hand rose unconsciously toward her face. "The doctors said I was fortunate. The burns could have been much worse." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, inadequate words for what she had endured. "Don't be. My scars taught me something valuable." "What's that?" "How quickly everything that seems important, beauty, social standing, others' approval, can burn away." She turned toward him. "And what remains when they do?" Thomas studied her veiled form, finding himself wondering not about the extent of her disfigurement, but about the strength it must have taken to rebuild her life after such trauma. He was struck by the sudden, uncomfortable realization that he knew very little about courage of that kind. "The wedding is in 2 days," he said. "If you've reconsidered, if you want to back out of this arrangement—" "Have you?" she interrupted. "Have I what?" "Reconsidered. Do you want to back out?" Thomas looked away, watching the approaching storm. The honest answer was yes. He had never wanted this marriage, this obligation. But something held him back from saying so, some nameless feeling he couldn't quite identify. "I made a commitment," he said finally. "As did I." Rebecca adjusted her veil. "Then I suppose we'll be married on Sunday as planned." She turned to go, pausing at the door. "Good night, Thomas." "Rebecca," he called after her. She stopped, waiting. "Will you... At the ceremony, will you remove the veil?" Even in the dim light, he saw her shoulders stiffen slightly. "Is that important to you?" "I'd like to know the face of the woman I'm pledging my life to." She was quiet for a moment. "Then yes, I will remove it. But I should warn you, Thomas, sometimes seeing clearly requires more than just looking." With that cryptic statement, she disappeared into the house, leaving Thomas alone with the approaching storm and the strange sense that he was standing on the edge of something momentous, something that would change him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Sunday dawned clear and cool, the storm having passed in the night, leaving the world washed clean. The small white church in Stone Creek was decorated simply, wildflowers in mason jars, a few ribbons on the pews. Only a handful of guests were present. Ranch hands and their families, the doctor and his wife, a few townspeople curious about the judge's long-absent daughter and her hasty marriage to the Blackwell heir. Thomas stood at the altar in his best, suit, hat in hand, feeling strangely calm. Whatever happened today, at least the uncertainty would end. He would see Rebecca's face, speak the vows, and begin whatever life awaited them. When the church door opened and she appeared on Jackson Blackwell's arm, a murmur ran through the small congregation. Her dress was ivory satin, high-necked and elegantly simple. Her veil was thicker than the one she had worn previously, completely obscuring her features. The wedding march played on the wheezy organ as she walked slowly down the aisle. Thomas watched her approach, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. This was it, the moment his life would change forever, for better or worse. Pastor Miller began the ceremony with practiced words about love and honor, commitment and sacrifice. Thomas barely heard him, his attention fixed on the veiled woman beside him, her gloved hands holding a small bouquet of white roses. Was she as nervous as he was? As resigned? As curious? "The rings, please," Pastor Miller said, and Thomas's. Ranch foreman stepped forward with the simple gold bands Thomas had purchased yesterday from the jeweler in town. "Do you, Thomas James Blackwell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Thomas swallowed hard. "I do." "And do you, Rebecca Ann Sullivan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Her voice was clear, unwavering. "Then by the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife." Pastor Miller nodded to Thomas. "You may kiss your bride." The moment had arrived. Thomas turned to face Rebecca fully, his hands surprisingly steady as he reached for her veil. The church was absolutely silent, every eye fixed on the unveiling of Rebecca Sullivan Blackwell. Slowly, carefully, Thomas lifted the heavy veil. As it rose, he braced himself for what he might see: scarring, disfigurement, ruin. What he saw instead took his breath away. Rebecca's face was revealed inch by inch, a strong chin, full lips, high cheekbones, and then, finally, her eyes. Deep brown and utterly clear, gazing directly into his with intelligence and challenge. Her skin was smooth and unblemished, her features striking in their symmetry and strength. There were no scars, no burns, no disfigurement of any kind. Rebecca Sullivan was beautiful. Thomas stared in shock, uncomprehending. The church around them buzzed with surprised whispers, but he barely heard them. He could focus only on the woman before him, the woman who had hidden not ugliness, but beauty. "You're not," he began, then stopped, confused. Rebecca's gaze didn't waver. "Scarred," she finished for him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Not on my face, Thomas, not where anyone can see." Before he could respond, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was brief, proper enough for a church ceremony, but Thomas felt something pass between them, a current of understanding, a question, a promise. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, Thomas realized with absolute certainty that nothing about this marriage would be what he had expected. Rebecca Sullivan, no, Rebecca Blackwell now, was clearly not the woman he thought he was marrying. The question that burned in his mind as they walked back down the aisle, his new wife's hand resting lightly on his arm, was simple and profound. Who exactly had he just pledged his life to? The wedding reception was a modest affair held on the wide veranda of the Raven's Crest main house. Lanterns hung from the eaves, casting warm light over tables laden with food prepared by Mrs. Winters and the wives of several ranch hands. A small band of local musicians played fiddle and guitar, while guests congratulated the newlyweds with varying degrees of sincerity. Throughout it all, Thomas couldn't stop stealing glances at his new wife's face. Rebecca had abandoned the veil entirely now, moving among the guests with graceful confidence, accepting well wishes with a smile that transformed her already striking features into something captivating. The mystery of her deception hung between them, unaddressed in the public setting but impossible to ignore. Jackson Blackwell seemed as surprised as anyone by Rebecca's unblemished appearance, though he masked it quickly behind his customary stoicism. When he approached the couple with a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied his new daughter-in-law. "Interesting choice, keeping your face hidden," he remarked bluntly. "Care to explain why you'd lead a man to believe he was marrying damaged goods?" "Father," Thomas warned, but Rebecca laid a restraining hand on his arm. "I never claimed to be damaged goods, Mr. Blackwell," she replied evenly. "The story of my accident is true. The assumption that it left me disfigured was just that, an assumption. One I chose not to correct." Jackson's eyebrows rose. "And why would you do that?" Rebecca met his gaze without flinching. "Because I wanted to know if your son was the kind of man who would honor his commitment to a woman he believed to be scarred. Character reveals itself most honestly when faced with disappointment." She glanced at Thomas, "or at least what one perceives as disappointment." Jackson studied her for a long moment, then surprised them both with a short bark of laughter. "Matthew always said you had your mother's spine and his mind. I see he wasn't exaggerating." He raised his glass slightly. "Welcome to the family, Rebecca. I think you'll make things interesting." As he walked away to speak with the foreman, Thomas turned to his wife with new questions forming. But before he could voice them, she spoke first. "Not here," she said quietly. "There's too much to explain, and too many ears eager for gossip." Thomas nodded reluctantly. "Later, then, but I will have answers, Rebecca." Her smile held a hint of challenge. Of course, marriage should be built on honesty, shouldn't it? The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. As tradition dictated, the bride and groom departed the reception early, retiring to the east wing of the main house, where Thomas's quarters had been hastily expanded to accommodate a wife. The awkwardness between them was palpable as they entered what was now their shared bedroom, a large room with a four-poster bed, dresser, writing desk, and sitting area near the window. Rebecca stood in the center of the room, her wedding dress gleaming softly in the lamplight. Without the veil, with her dark hair arranged in elegant coils at the nape of her neck, she looked like a stranger to Thomas. A beautiful, enigmatic stranger he had just promised to spend his life with. "I imagine you have questions," she said, removing her gloves with deliberate care, more than a few. Thomas remained by the door, maintaining his distance. "Let's start with the most obvious. Why the deception? Why let everyone believe you were disfigured?" Rebecca moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit ranch yard. "When your father wrote to me about this arrangement, his letter made it abundantly clear what he was offering: financial security, the Blackwell name, and a husband who would tolerate a scarred wife in exchange for water rights." She turned to face him. "He never bothered to verify the rumors about my appearance. He simply assumed the worst and decided it was a price worth paying." "And you decided to test us," Thomas concluded, an edge of anger entering his voice, "to see if we would still honor the agreement despite your condition." "Not you. Him." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "I needed to know what kind of man I was binding myself to, Thomas, whether you would treat me with kindness out of character or mere duty, whether you would see beyond appearances or merely endure them. So my reaction to your supposed disfigurement was some kind of moral test. Call it self-preservation." She moved to the dressing table, beginning to remove the pins from her hair. "A woman in my position can't afford to be reckless with her future." "And what position is that exactly?" Thomas asked, crossing the room to stand behind her. Because, from where I'm standing, you've deliberately misled everyone, including me, about something rather significant. Rebecca met his gaze in the mirror, her hair falling in waves around her shoulders. My position is that of a woman with no family, no fortune, and few options in a world that values women primarily for their beauty and breeding capabilities. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes flashed with emotion. I needed to know if you were marrying me for the water rights alone, or if you might eventually come to value me as a person. Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. And you couldn't simply ask, have an honest conversation? Would you have given me honest answers, she challenged me, or would you have said whatever was necessary to secure your father's legacy? The question struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Thomas turned away, unable to meet her gaze. The fire was real, Rebecca continued, her voice softening. I was trapped in that laboratory. My clothes did catch fire. But the student who saved me, she was the one who suffered the burns, not me. She rose from the dressing table, crossing to where Thomas stood. Mary Halstead threw herself over me without hesitation, without calculation. She carries the scars I should have borne. Thomas heard the catch in her voice, genuine emotion breaking through her composed exterior. What happened to her? He asked. She returned to her family in Philadelphia. Last I heard, she was teaching science to young girls. Rebecca looked down at her hands. I've never stopped feeling that I owe her a debt I can never repay. And somehow testing me was a way to honor that debt? No. Rebecca met his eyes directly. But it was a way to ensure I didn't waste the life she saved by tying it to a man who couldn't see beyond surface appearances. The room fell silent as Thomas absorbed her words. There was logic in her reasoning, even if he didn't particularly appreciate being the subject of her experiment. And yet, beneath his irritation lay a grudging respect for her strategy, calculating, yes, but born of necessity rather than malice. So, where does this leave us? He finally asked. Married under false pretenses. Strangers sharing a name and a bed. False assumptions, perhaps, but my commitment is genuine. Rebecca's expression was earnest now, the artifice stripped away. I intend to be a good wife to you, Thomas, to work alongside you, to build something meaningful from this arrangement. The question is whether you're willing to do the same, now that you know the truth. Thomas studied her, this complex, intelligent woman who had outmaneuvered both. Him and his father. He should have been furious, and part of him was. But another part, a part he hadn't known existed until now, was intrigued. I need time, he said finally. This isn't what I agreed to. A flash of hurt crossed her face before. She masked it. No, I suppose it isn't. You agreed to marry a damaged woman out of obligation. Instead, you find yourself married to an undamaged one who expects to be treated as a partner. That's not fair. Perhaps not. She moved to her trunk, which had been brought up earlier. I'll sleep in the adjoining room tonight. We both need, and time to adjust to our new circumstances. Thomas wanted to object, to press for more answers, but exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed him. This day had been nothing like what he'd expected, and tomorrow would bring new complications. Good night, Rebecca, he said instead. She paused at the connecting door, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Good night, husband. Morning arrived with the insistent crowing of roosters and the familiar sounds of a ranch awakening. Thomas dressed quickly, his mind still churning with questions and confusion about the woman sleeping in the adjoining room. He slipped out without waking her, eager for the simple clarity of ranch work. The day passed in a blur of physical labor, mending fences, checking on pregnant mares, consulting with the foreman about the upcoming cattle drive. It was nearly supper time when Thomas returned to the main house, dusty and tired, but with a clearer head. He found Rebecca in his father's study, bent over the ranch's ledgers, making notes with quick, precise strokes of a pencil. She'd changed from her wedding finery into a practical dress of deep blue, her hair braided and coiled at the nape of her neck. Without makeup or formal attire, her beauty was less dramatic, but somehow more striking, natural, unaffected. "What are you doing?" he asked from the doorway. Rebecca looked up, seemingly unsurprised by his presence. "Reviewing your accounts. There are some inconsistencies I thought you should be aware of." Thomas frowned, crossing to the desk. "Inconsistencies? Here." She pointed to a column of figures. "And here. Your cattle broker in Helena has been charging you 15% above market rate for transport, and someone's been skimming from the supply budget, about $30 a month for the past year." Thomas stared at the ledgers, then at his wife. "How did you notice this?" "My father was a judge, but our family business was banking before the crash of '87. She leaned back, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I kept our books from the time I was 16. Numbers don't lie, even when people do." Thomas pulled up a chair beside her, examining her notations with new interest. "Does my father know you're going through his records?" "Your father is the one who asked me to look," Rebecca replied, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Apparently, he wanted to see if I was as sharp with figures as Judge Sullivan always claimed." "And are you? Sharp enough to save Raven's crest? Nearly $500 a year if you address these issues." She closed the ledger. "Your cattle broker is taking advantage, and I suspect your former supply manager, Mr. Reynolds, was responsible for the missing funds before he left last month." Thomas leaned back, studying her with new eyes. "Where did you learn all this?" "I doubt they taught accounting at that women's college." "No, they taught chemistry, which I excelled at." A small smile played on her lips. "But I've always had a head for numbers. My father called it the most unladylike talent." "I doubt my father considers it unladylike if it saves him money," Thomas observed dryly. "No, he seemed quite pleased." Rebecca straightened the papers before her. "He's asked me to review all the accounts going forward." Thomas wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unsettled by how quickly Rebecca had insinuated herself into ranch operations. "You've been busy for your first day as a Blackwell. I don't believe in wasting time." She met his gaze steadily, "especially when there's so much at stake." Before Thomas could respond, Mrs. Winters appeared in the doorway to announce that supper was ready. The housekeeper's curious gaze moved between them, clearly wondering how the newlyweds were faring after their unusual beginning. Supper that night was another tense affair, though for different reasons than the previous evening. Jackson monopolized the conversation with Rebecca, discussing ranch finances and operations while barely acknowledging his son's presence. Thomas watched with growing frustration as his father treated his new wife more like a business partner than an in-law. "We should renegotiate with that cattle broker immediately," Jackson declared, cutting into his roast beef with characteristic decisiveness. Rebecca's found 3 other companies that would charge substantially less. "I merely compiled the information," Rebecca demurred. "The decision is yours, of course." "Nonsense. You've got a better head for business than half the men in Stone Creek." Jackson shot a pointed look at Thomas. "Maybe you can teach my son something about financial acumen." Thomas set down his fork with deliberate care. "I wasn't aware my financial decisions were causing concern." "They weren't," Jackson said dismissively, "but there's always room for improvement." An uncomfortable silence descended on the table. Rebecca glanced between father and son, then cleared her throat softly. "Actually, I've been reviewing the breeding program Thomas implemented last year," she said. "The decision to invest in that Hereford bull was quite forward-thinking. The calves are showing excellent weight gain and hardiness." Thomas looked at her in surprise. He hadn't mentioned the breeding program to her. "I took the liberty of examining. "The livestock records after I finished with the financial ledgers," she explained, catching his expression. "It's important to understand all aspects of a ranch this size," Jackson grunted. The bull was expensive and worth every penny based on the projected returns. Rebecca turned to Thomas. "Would you be willing to show me the new calves tomorrow? I'd like to see them firsthand." There was something in her eyes, a request that went beyond the simple question. Thomas found himself nodding. "Of course. We can ride out after breakfast." The remainder of the meal passed with less tension, though Thomas remained quiet, observing this new dynamic with mixed emotions. His wife was clearly intelligent and capable, qualities he'd always respected in theory, but rarely encountered in practice among the women of his acquaintance. Yet there was something unsettling about the ease with which she'd stepped into life at Raven's Crest, as if she'd been preparing for this role all along. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in awkward silence, Thomas broached the subject that had been on his mind all evening. "Thank you," he said abruptly, "for what you said about the breeding program." Rebecca looked up from where she was brushing her hair at the dressing table. "I didn't say it to curry favor. The records speak for themselves. It was a sound investment. Still, you didn't have to mention it. Your father is a difficult man." She set down the brush. "He respects strength and results, not sentiment. I thought you might appreciate someone acknowledging your contributions." Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit ranch. "He's always been hard on me. Nothing I do is ever quite good enough." "Men like your father don't know how to express approval," Rebecca observed, joining him at the window. "They fear it might lead to complacency. You seem to understand him well after just 2 days." "I grew up with a father cut from similar cloth, different profession, same unyielding expectations." She stood close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair oil. "It doesn't mean they don't value us, just that they don't know how to say it." Thomas turned to look at her, struck by the unexpected insight. "Is that why you agreed to this marriage? Because you understood my father's kindness?" "Partly." Her gaze was direct, unflinching. "And partly because I had nowhere else to go that wouldn't involve dependency on distant relatives who see me as a burden. At least here, I have the chance to be useful, to build something of my own." "Something of our own," Thomas corrected quietly. The distinction hung in the air between them, significant and unexplored. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, then softened. "Yes," she said. "Perhaps that's what we're doing." Thomas realized with some surprise that he was standing very close to his wife now, close enough to see the flecks of amber in her brown eyes, the slight unevenness of her eyebrows, the small scar near her hairline that he hadn't noticed before. "Not perfect then, just real. Humans. I'm still angry about the deception," he said, his voice low. "I know." She didn't look away. "As you have every right to be. But I'm beginning to think I might have misjudged you in other ways. As I may have misjudged you." Her admission seemed to cost her something. "I thought you would be exactly like your father." "And am I?" Rebecca studied him, her expression thoughtful. "No. There's something different in you. Something that questions rather than demands. Something that listens." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Then Thomas stepped, aback, breaking the tenuous connection. "We should get some rest," he said. "If we're riding out to see the calves tomorrow, we'll want an early start." Rebecca nodded, and if she was disappointed by his retreat, she hid it well. "Of course. Good night." "Thomas, good night, Rebecca." As he lay awake later, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person breathing in the adjoining room, Thomas realized that his anger had begun to give way to curiosity. His new wife was a puzzle, complex, challenging, and unexpectedly compelling. She had deceived him, yes, but perhaps with better reason than he'd initially assumed. What remained to be seen was whether two people brought together by obligation and manipulation could build something genuine from such a beginning. And whether he was brave enough to try. The dawn broke clear and cool, mist clinging to the valley floor like a reluctant ghost. Thomas woke to find Rebecca already dressed in a split riding skirt and simple blouse, her hair braided and pinned securely for riding. "Mrs. Winters said breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes, she informed him. "I've asked the stable boy to saddle horses for us." Thomas blinked away sleep, momentarily disoriented by this businesslike woman in his bedroom. "You're eager to see." "The calves. I'm eager to understand what I've married into," she corrected with a small smile. "Every aspect of it." An hour later they rode side by side across the eastern pastures, comfortable silence between them. Thomas watched surreptitiously as Rebecca handled her mount, a spirited chestnut mare that had thrown more than one experienced rider. She sat the saddle with easy confidence, guiding the horse with subtle movements of her hands and legs rather than forcing compliance. "You ride well," he observed. "I grew up on horseback." She patted the mare's neck affectionately. "Though it's been some years, I'm glad to find the skill hasn't abandoned me." They crested a small rise, and below them spread a meadow where the new calves and their mothers grazed in the morning sunshine. Thomas dismounted, holding the reins of Rebecca's horse as she swung down beside him. "They're beautiful," she said, surveying the red-brown calves with their distinctive white faces. "Strong-looking, too. The Hereford blood is making a difference. They're more resistant to drought and cold than our previous stock." Thomas couldn't keep the pride from his voice. "Another generation of selective breeding, and we'll have a herd that can thrive even in the hardest winters." Rebecca walked closer to the grazing cattle, moving slowly to avoid startling them. One bold calf approached her, curious nose extended. She remained perfectly still, allowing it to investigate her scent. "Hello there, little one," she murmured. The calf snuffled at her skirt, then allowed her to stroke its forehead briefly before darting back to its mother. Thomas watched the interaction with interest. "You're good with animals." "I respect them," she replied simply. "They know when you're afraid or when you mean harm." She turned to him, her face animated in a way he hadn't seen before. "This is wonderful work, Thomas. I can see why you're so committed to it." Something warm unfurled in his chest at her genuine appreciation. "It's not just about better cattle," he found himself explaining. "It's about adapting to this land instead of fighting it, working with nature instead of trying to bend it to our will." Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Like grafting hardier stock onto an existing tree rather than uprooting the whole orchard." Exactly. Thomas was surprised by how precisely she had captured his philosophy. "My father believes in forcing the land to yield. I think there's another way. A marriage of old and new," Rebecca observed. "Tradition and innovation." Their eyes met, both aware of the parallel to their own situation. Something passed between them then, not quite understanding, but perhaps the beginning of it. A shout from the distance broke the moment. They turned to see a ranch hand galloping toward them, waving urgently. "Mr. Blackwell, fire in the south pasture. Lightning strike from last night's storm must have smoldered." Thomas was immediately alert. "How bad?" "Spread fast with this wind." The ranch hand was breathless. "Men are gathering, but we need every hand." "I'll come at once." Thomas turned to Rebecca. "You should return to the house." "I'm coming with you," she interrupted, already moving toward her horse. "This isn't women's work, Rebecca." She mounted in one fluid motion, gathering the reins. "Then consider me unwomanly today. I know something about fires, remember?" Before he could argue further, she urged her mare into a gallop, following the ranch hand toward the distant pillar of smoke now visible on the horizon. Thomas had no choice but to follow, concern and irritation warring within him. By the time they reached the south pasture, The fire had engulfed nearly an acre of dry grass and was moving steadily toward a stand of pine trees. If it reached the trees, it would be nearly impossible to contain. Ranch hands formed a line, beating at the flames with wet burlap sacks and shoveling dirt to create a firebreak. Thomas joined them immediately, calling orders and grabbing a shovel from a nearby wagon. To his surprise, Rebecca didn't hang back or merely watch. She dismounted, tied her horse to a safe distance, and approached the supply wagon. "Where are your empty grain sacks?" she asked the boy minding the supplies. "Here, Mom," he replied, bewildered, pointing to a stack. Rebecca quickly grabbed several, then headed to the water barrel. "Soak these thoroughly," she instructed, demonstrating, by plunging one into the water. "Then wring them just enough so they're not dripping but still saturated." The boy complied, still confused. Rebecca turned to the men nearby who were waiting for tools. "Take these and cover your faces when you approach the fire," she called out. "Wet fabric over your nose and mouth will help keep the smoke from overwhelming you. Work in shifts, 2 minutes in, then retreat for fresh air." The men looked to Thomas, uncertain whether to take orders from his new wife. He hesitated only briefly before nodding his approval. "Do as she says." With this endorsement, the firefighting effort became more organized. Men with wet clothes covering their faces lasted longer before the smoke forced them to retreat. Those waiting their turn prepared by soaking sacks and refilling water buckets. Rebecca herself didn't shy away from the work. She joined the women who had arrived from nearby homesteads, forming a bucket brigade to keep water flowing to the firefighters. When one of the younger ranch hands collapsed from smoke inhalation, she was at his side immediately, loosening his collar and instructing others how to help him recover. "Small sips of water," she directed, supporting the young man's head. "Don't let him gulp it down, and keep him in the shade until his breathing steadies." For nearly 3 hours, they battled the blaze under the merciless Montana sun. Finally, with the last flames smothered and men patrolling the perimeter to watch for flare-ups, Thomas found himself standing beside Rebecca, both of them soot-stained and exhausted. "That was quick thinking with the wet clothes," he said, offering her his canteen. She took a careful drink before responding. "Basic chemistry. The water helps filter the particulates in the smoke." She passed the canteen back to him. "Your men worked bravely, as did my wife," Thomas replied, a new respect in his voice. "Though I don't recall firefighting being listed among the duties of a ranch owner's spouse." A smile broke through the grime on her face. "Perhaps you should have read the contract more carefully." The unexpected humor caught him off guard, and Thomas found himself laughing, a genuine laugh that released some of the tension he'd carried since their wedding. Rebecca joined him, her own laughter soft but real, and in that moment something shifted between them. As they rode back to the ranch house side by side, Thomas glanced at his wife's profile, smudged with soot, hair escaping its pins, clothes rumpled and smoke-scented. She looked nothing like the veiled mystery who had stepped off the train, nor the composed bride who had surprised him at the altar. This, Rebecca, was something else entirely, capable, determined, unafraid to step into chaos when needed. For the first time since their hasty marriage, Thomas found himself wondering not what he had gotten himself into, but who exactly he had married, and whether perhaps his father's manipulations had accidentally led him to someone unexpectedly valuable. Word of the fire, and of Rebecca Blackwell's unexpected role in fighting it, spread through Stone Creek with the speed of the flames themselves. By the following Sunday, when Thomas and Rebecca made their first appearance as a married couple at the local church, the entire town buzzed with curiosity about the judge's daughter, who had returned so changed from her years away. The small white church was more crowded than usual, pews filled with ranchers and townspeople whose interest in spiritual matters had suddenly intensified. As Thomas and Rebecca walked down the aisle to the Blackwell family's traditional front row seat, A wave of whispers followed them, like rustling leaves. "That's her, Judge Sullivan's girl. Heard she fought the fire alongside the men. No scars at all, pretty as a picture. Tricked old Jackson into the marriage, clever thing." Rebecca kept her head high, her hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm. She wore a tailored dress of deep green that complemented her coloring without drawing undue attention. No veil today, just a modest hat with a small brim that framed rather than obscured her face. Thomas found himself oddly proud to be escorting her, despite the complicated circumstances of their union. Pastor Miller's sermon that day focused, perhaps not coincidentally, on the Book of Ruth and the blessings of unexpected partnerships. Thomas barely listened, too aware of the community's scrutiny and his wife's composed profile beside him. Rebecca, however, followed the sermon with apparent interest, occasionally nodding slightly at particular points. After the service, tradition dictated that families linger on the church steps, exchanging pleasantries and weekly news. Thomas steeled himself for the inevitable awkwardness as he guided Rebecca into the bright Sunday sunshine. They were immediately surrounded by curious well-wishers, some sincere, others merely seeking gossip. Thomas fielded congratulations with stiff politeness, while Rebecca charmed their neighbors with gracious smiles and thoughtful questions about their families and ranches. "Mrs. Blackwell," called Harriet Thompson, wife of the town's most prosperous merchant and self-appointed arbiter of Stone Creek society. "We were so surprised by your unexpected appearance at your wedding. What an unusual strategy to hide. Such a lovely face." The question hung in the air, its prying nature thinly veiled by a veneer of pleasantry. A small circle formed around them, eager for Rebecca's response. Thomas felt himself tensing, prepared to intervene, but Rebecca merely smiled, a smile that reached her eyes but somehow revealed nothing. "Mrs. Thompson, how kind of you to notice," she replied, her voice pleasant but firm. "In my experience, people often see what they expect to see rather than what's truly before them. I find it valuable to occasionally challenge those expectations." The older woman blinked, uncertain whether she'd been complimented or chastised. Before she could formulate a response, Rebecca continued smoothly. "I understand you organize the town's harvest festival each autumn. Thomas speaks highly of your organizational skills. I'd be grateful for any advice you might offer, as I hope to contribute in my new role here." The deflection was masterful, acknowledging the woman's status while redirecting the conversation to safer ground. Mrs. Thompson preened at the recognition of her importance and launched into a detailed account of festival preparations. Gossip, momentarily forgotten. Thomas watched with growing admiration as Rebecca navigated the social minefield with graceful ease, neither confronting the town's curiosity directly nor shrinking from it. She was building bridges where he would have erected walls, finding connections where he would have maintained distance. Later, as they drove back to Raven's Crest in the family buggy, Thomas finally addressed what he'd observed. "You handled that well," he said, eyes on the road ahead. "Better than I would have." Rebecca adjusted her hat against the breeze. Social navigation isn't so different from firefighting. You identify the threat, contain it, and redirect its energy before it can spread. Is that what you were doing? With Mrs. Thompson, containing a threat, I was making an ally rather than an adversary, Rebecca corrected. That woman influences half the opinions in Stone Creek. Better to have her speaking well of the Blackwell family than ill. Thomas glanced at her with new appreciation. "You're quite strategic. I prefer practical." A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Besides, it's easier to change minds through kindness than confrontation. My father taught me that, for all his stern ways." "You miss him," Thomas observed, hearing the subtle shift in her tone. Rebecca looked out at the passing landscape, her expression thoughtful. "I miss what he could have been, had life been kinder to him. After my mother died, something in him hardened. He loved me, I think, but never quite knew what to do with a daughter who reminded him so much of his lost wife. The personal revelation surprised Thomas. In the weeks since their wedding, Rebecca had shared little of her past, beyond what directly affected their arrangement. "Is that why you went east for schooling?" he asked. "To give him space?" "Partly." She turned back to him, her eyes clear and direct. "And partly because I wanted to become more than just the judge's daughter. I wanted knowledge that wasn't dependent on anyone's approval or permission." Chemistry, Thomas remembered. An unusual choice. The study of how elements combine and transform, Rebecca said, a genuine passion entering her voice. How invisible forces create visible change. There's something miraculous in understanding the building blocks of the world. Her enthusiasm was captivating. Thomas found himself wondering what other passions lay beneath her composed exterior, what other interests and ambitions she had set aside to become Mrs. Blackwell. "And now you're here," he said, "applying chemical principles to firefighting and social diplomacy in Montana Territory." Rebecca laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and warm. "Life rarely follows the paths we imagine for ourselves, does it?" "No," Thomas agreed, the sound of her laughter settling something in him. "It certainly doesn't." The following weeks brought a rhythm to their unusual marriage. During the days, they largely moved in separate orbits, Thomas overseeing ranch operations, Rebecca managing household affairs, and continuing her work on the ranch's accounts. Evenings found them sharing meals, sometimes with Jackson, sometimes alone, discussing the day's events with increasing ease. They still maintained separate sleeping arrangements, the physical aspect of marriage an unaddressed territory between them. Yet something was shifting, a foundation being built beneath their paper partnership, brick by cautious brick. Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations, curious about Rebecca's perspective on matters both large and small. She thought differently than he did, more analytically in some ways, more intuitively in others. When a dispute arose between ranch hands, her suggested resolution often considered angles he'd overlooked. When decisions about breeding stock or grazing rotations needed to be made, she asked questions that clarified his own thinking. For her part, Rebecca seemed to be finding her place at Raven's Crest. Mrs. Winters reported with approval that the new Mrs. Blackwell took a genuine interest in household matters without overstepping. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of the boss's scholarly wife, had warmed to her after the fire and her subsequent willingness to learn about their work without interfering. Even Jackson Blackwell showed grudging respect for his new daughter-in-law, consulting her about business matters with increasing frequency. If he noticed the gradual thawing between his son and Rebecca, he kept his observations to himself, for once abstaining from commentary on Thomas's personal affairs. It was late June when the invitation arrived, an embossed card requesting the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Blackwell's company at the governor's summer ball in Helena. Such invitations came yearly to prominent ranching families, though the Blackwells rarely attended, preferring to avoid the political maneuvering that characterized such events. "We should decline," Thomas said, setting the invitation aside at breakfast. "It's a 2-day journey each way, for one night of tedious conversation with politicians and land speculators." "Actually," Rebecca said carefully, "I think we should consider accepting." Thomas looked up in surprise. "You want to attend a political ball?" "The new railroad commissioner will be there," she explained. "The man who will determine freight rates for cattle shipments for the next 5 years. Understanding dawned. "And you think we should lobby for favorable terms?" "I think a personal connection might prove valuable," Rebecca replied, buttering her toast with precise movements. "Especially with the expansion plans your father's considering." Thomas studied her thoughtfully. "You've been discussing expansion plans with my father?" "He values a fresh perspective," Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "I hope that doesn't bother you." "It might have once," Thomas admitted, "but I've come to appreciate your perspective as well." He picked up the invitation again, considering. "A week away from the ranch in the height of summer, the foreman is more than capable," Rebecca pointed out. "And it would give us an opportunity to visit the Helena Bank about those investment options we discussed." Thomas noted her use of "we," a small thing, perhaps, but significant. In the weeks since their marriage, Rebecca had gradually shifted from speaking of Blackwell affairs as yours to ours. "Very well," he decided, "we'll attend, though I warn you these affairs are generally more about appearances than substance." Rebecca smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Then it's fortunate that I'm becoming quite adept at managing appearances, isn't it?" The journey to Helena was long, but not unpleasant. They traveled by private carriage, stopping overnight at a respectable hotel in Bozeman. If the hotel proprietor found it odd that the newlyweds requested a suite with adjoining rooms rather than a single chamber, he was professional enough not to comment. As they neared the territorial capital, the landscape changed. Rolling hills, giving way to the dramatic backdrop of mountains, scattered homesteads yielding to more densely populated settlements. Helena itself was a study in contrasts, with elegant mansions built by mining fortunes standing alongside practical businesses and government buildings. The governor's residence, where the ball was to be held, was among the grandest structures, a sprawling edifice of stone and timber perched on a hill overlooking the city. By the time Thomas and Rebecca arrived, dressed in their finest evening attire, carriages already lined the curved drive, disgorging the territory's elite in a parade of silks, jewels, and careful smiles. Rebecca wore a gown of midnight blue silk, its styling elegant without being ostentatious. Her only jewelry was a simple silver pendant that had belonged to her mother, a detail she had shared with Thomas that morning with unexpected vulnerability. Her hair was arranged in an intricate updo that framed her features perfectly, transforming her everyday beauty into something that drew admiring glances as they entered the ballroom. Thomas, uncomfortable in formal wear, but striking nonetheless, in his tailored black suit, found himself oddly proud to enter with Rebecca on his arm. Whatever complicated feelings lay between them, in this moment they presented a united front to the curious eyes of Helena society. "Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Blackwell," announced the steward at the door, and heads turned throughout the crowded ballroom. "Remember," Rebecca murmured as they moved into the glittering space, "Commissioner Hayes is our priority. He's supposed to be a florid man with a distinctive white mustache." Thomas nodded, scanning the room. "And you're certain this approach is better than my father's preferred method of sending strongly worded letters?" "Relationships before requests," Rebecca replied with a small smile. "People tend to favor those they've broken bread with." They circulated smoothly, Rebecca's social grace complementing Thomas's more reserved demeanor. She drew people out with thoughtful questions. He provided knowledgeable commentary on ranching matters when the conversation turned to cattle or land management. Together, they made a more effective pairing than Thomas would have anticipated. "Thomas Blackwell, as I live and breathe," called a booming voice. They turned to find a portly gentleman approaching, his white mustache indeed, distinctive, waxed to precise points. "Last time I saw you, you were no higher than my knee. Your father is still running Raven's Crest like his personal empire." "Commissioner Hayes," Thomas greeted him with a firm handshake. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Rebecca." "A pleasure." "My dear," Hayes said, bowing slightly over Rebecca's extended hand. "I knew your father well, fine Judge Matthew Sullivan. Montana lost a good man when he passed." "You're very kind to say so," Rebecca replied warmly. "He spoke highly of you as well." Hayes preened visibly at this, though Thomas suspected it was a diplomatic fiction. Judge Sullivan had rarely expressed admiration for government officials. I understand you're reviewing freight rates for the coming season, Thomas said, steering the conversation toward their objective. Indeed, indeed. Complicated business must balance the needs of the railroads with those of our producers. Hayes rocked back on his heels importantly. Can't have the backbone of our territorial economy breaking under unfair burdens, eh? Rebecca tilted her head in perfect attentive interest. It must require tremendous insight to balance such competing interests. I imagine you've developed quite a sophisticated approach over your years of service. The flattery was subtle but effective. Hayes launched into an explanation of rate structures and regulatory considerations that Thomas followed with careful attention, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed his thorough understanding of the issues. Rebecca's thoughtful observations at key moments demonstrated that she, too, had studied the matter in detail. By the time the commissioner was called away to greet the governor, he had promised to give special consideration to the unique challenges facing operations of Raven's Crest's caliber, as close to a commitment for favorable treatment as they could have hoped for. That was masterfully done, Thomas murmured as they moved toward the refreshment table. You have quite a talent for this. We make a good team, Rebecca replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Your knowledge with my charm? Thomas suggested, a smile playing at his lips. I was going to say strategic conversation. She corrected primly, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. As the evening progressed, they danced once. A waltz performed with correct form, but cautious distance. Thomas found himself noticing details about his wife he'd previously overlooked. The graceful curve of her neck, the subtle floral scent she wore, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled genuinely rather than socially. The moment was interrupted by a voice that caused Rebecca to freeze mid-step. Rebecca Sullivan, or I suppose it's Blackwell now. They turned to find a tall, distinguished man in his 40s, his features handsome in a severe way, his attire impeccable. Something in his expression as he regarded Rebecca sent a wave of protectiveness through Thomas. Professor Harrington, Rebecca acknowledged, her voice carefully neutral. I didn't expect to see you so far west. Academic conference in San Francisco, followed by a consulting position with a mining concern here. His eyes traveled, assessing her. You look... Well, marriage agrees with you more than scholarship did, apparently. Thomas felt Rebecca's hand tighten on his arm. My husband, Thomas Blackwell, she said. Thomas Professor Edmund Harrington of Everton Women's College. He was head of the chemistry department during my studies. Thomas extended his hand with deliberate formality. Professor, you had the privilege of teaching my wife, I understand. Harrington shook his hand with a grip just firm enough to suggest competition. Indeed, one of our more determined students. Though I confess I was surprised to hear she'd abandoned her academic pursuits for, he glanced around the ballroom, more domestic ambitions. I wouldn't characterize managing a 15,000-acre cattle operation as primarily domestic, Thomas replied evenly. How fascinating. Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes. And does your husband appreciate having such an educated wife, Rebecca, one who can discourse on molecular structures while overseeing the household accounts? There was something in his tone, a subtle mockery, an implied intimacy that set Thomas's teeth on edge. Rebecca's expression remained composed, but he felt the tension in her body where their arms connected. My wife's intelligence is one of her many admirable qualities, Thomas said before Rebecca could respond. Raven's Crest has benefited tremendously from her analytical skills and insight. How progressive of you, Harrington remarked, his tone suggesting the opposite. He turned back to Rebecca. I often wondered what became of you after the incident. Such a tragedy about Miss Halstead. I understand her family removed her from Academic life entirely, Rebecca paled slightly. Mary's sacrifice was extraordinarily brave. I've never forgotten what I owe her. Yes. Well, Harrington swirled his drink thoughtfully. Fortunate that you emerged unscathed while she did not. The implication hung in the air, ugly and insinuating. Thomas felt a surge of anger, but Rebecca spoke first, her voice low but steady. Nothing about that day was fortunate, Professor. If you'll excuse us, I believe the governor is about to make his address. She turned away, Thomas following her lead. They had taken only a few steps when Harrington's voice reached them again. She never told you the whole story. Did she, Mr. Blackwell? About the fire, about why she left Everton so suddenly? You might ask her sometime. It's quite illuminating. Thomas felt Rebecca falter just for a moment before continuing across the ballroom with her head high. He guided her toward a relatively quiet alcove, concerned by the rigid set of her shoulders and the carefully controlled expression on her face. "Rebecca," he said quietly. "What was that about?" She drew a deep breath, composing herself. "Professor, Harrington and I had disagreements during my time at Everton. He holds certain views about women's intellectual capabilities that I challenged to his displeasure. It seemed more personal than academic," Thomas observed carefully. Rebecca's eyes met his, a decision forming behind them. It was, in some ways, his expressed interest in me that went beyond the professional. When I rejected his advances, he made my academic life increasingly difficult. Anger flared in Thomas again, sharper this time. Did he have something to do with the laboratory fire? No, Rebecca shook her head, at least not directly. But afterwards, he suggested that my work had been careless, that I had endangered others through incompetence. He used the incident to discredit my research and my standing at the college. And this Mary Halstead, the woman who was injured saving, you? Rebecca's expression softened with remembered pain. Mary was brilliant, far more talented than I in chemistry. She should have had a magnificent scientific career ahead of her. Instead, she suffered terribly because of an accident in a laboratory where I had insisted we work late. Her voice caught slightly. Harrington was right about one thing. I left Everton shortly after. I couldn't face the whispers, the blame. I travelled, taught at a small school in Pennsylvania for a time, and eventually returned west when I learned of my father's death. Thomas studied her face, seeing the genuine regret and old pain etched there. You believe you were responsible for what happened to her. I was responsible for starting the experiment, for insisting we continue despite the late hour. Her hands twisted together briefly before she stilled them. Mary never blamed me, but you blame yourself, Thomas finished gently, and carried that burden alone. Rebecca looked up at him, vulnerability plain in her eyes, for perhaps the first time since he'd known her. I didn't tell you the complete truth about the fire, not because I wanted to deceive you, but because it's the most painful chapter of my life, my greatest regret. Thomas considered this, understanding dawning. And that's why you tested me with the veil, not just to see if I could accept imperfection, but because you carry scars of a different kind. Yes, the word was simple, but weighted with meaning. Before Thomas could respond, the governor's voice boomed through the ballroom, calling for attention as he prepared to address his guests. The moment of intimate disclosure shattered, replaced by social obligation. Rebecca straightened her shoulders, the vulnerability vanishing behind her public composure. "We should join the others," she said. Thomas nodded, but as they moved to rejoin the crowd, he took her hand in his, not just offering his arm as propriety dictated, but holding her fingers in a gesture of support and growing understanding. After a moment's surprise, Rebecca's hand tightened around his, acceptance and gratitude in the simple contact. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of political speeches and social niceties. Professor Harrington kept his distance, though, Thomas occasionally caught him watching Rebecca with an expression that combined resentment and something more troubling. When they finally departed, Thomas felt a palpable sense of relief as he handed Rebecca into their waiting carriage. They rode in silence through Helena's darkened streets, each absorbed in private thoughts. It wasn't until they reached their hotel that Rebecca spoke again. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly as they entered their suite. "I should have told you everything from the beginning." Thomas removed his jacket, considering his response carefully. "We all have parts of ourselves we protect, Rebecca, stories we find difficult to share." Even so. She stood by the window, moonlight silvering her profile. "Our marriage may have begun as an arrangement, but you deserve honesty." "Would you like to tell me now?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. "The full story?" Rebecca turned to face him, searching his expression for judgment and finding none. Slowly, haltingly at first, then with increasing clarity, she recounted the events that had shaped her. Her passionate pursuit of chemistry against her father's wishes, her friendship with Mary Halstead, Harrington's unwanted attention and subsequent undermining of her work, the devastating fire and its aftermath. After Mary's recovery, her family took her home to Philadelphia. They blamed Everton, and specifically me, for what happened. Her father forbade us from communicating. Rebecca's voice grew softer. "I tried to visit her once, but was turned away at the door. The last I heard, she was teaching basic sciences at a girls' school. Her research career ended before it truly began." "And you've carried this guilt ever since," Thomas observed, "letting it shape your decisions, your sense of what you deserve." Rebecca looked startled at his insight. "I suppose I have," she admitted. "It seemed appropriate somehow, a form of penance, including marrying a stranger for security rather than pursuing your own ambitions." She considered this, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps, though I found unexpected satisfaction at Raven's Crest. Different from what I imagined for myself, but valuable nonetheless." Thomas took a chance, reaching out to brush a stray tendril of hair from her cheek. She stilled at his touch, but didn't withdraw. "What did you imagine for yourself, Rebecca? Before the fire, before our marriage?" A wistful smile touched her lips. "I wanted to teach, to conduct research, to make some small contribution to our understanding of the natural world." She shook her head slightly. "Foolish dreams for a woman in this time and place." "Not foolish," Thomas countered, "just difficult, and perhaps not impossible even now." Rebecca looked up at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "Raven's Crest is more than cattle and grassland. It's a living laboratory of sorts, soil conditions, plant varieties, animal breeding. There's science in everything we do, though we rarely name it as such." He spoke slowly, the idea forming as he articulated it. "The new schoolhouse in Stone Creek stands empty most of the year. Perhaps there's a way to create something there. Classes for those who wish to learn, experiments that might benefit the community." Hope flickered in Rebecca's eyes, quickly tempered by practicality. "Your father would never approve of his daughter-in-law teaching science to ranch children." "My father doesn't need to approve of everything we do," Thomas replied with newfound certainty. "Raven's Crest will be ours someday, not his. We can begin building the future we want now, in small ways." "We," Rebecca repeated softly. "You speak as though our arrangement has become something more." Thomas studied her face in the moonlight. The intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her features, the complexity he was only beginning to appreciate. "Hasn't it?" he asked simply. The question hung between them, fraught with possibility. Rebecca's gaze held his, searching, considering. "I didn't expect this," she finally said. "When I agreed to marry you, I thought I was accepting a practical partnership, security in exchange for water rights and household management. And now? Now I find myself..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. caring what you think, valuing your respect, wondering if we might build something meaningful together beyond what duty or circumstance dictated. Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. I wonder the same thing. Rebecca glanced down at their joined hands, then back to his face. We barely know each other. We're learning, he countered, and what I've learned so far, I admire. The confession hung in the air between them, honest and unembellished. Rebecca's expression softened, vulnerability and hope mingling in her. Gaze, it's late, she said finally. We should rest. The journey home begins early tomorrow. Thomas nodded, releasing her hand reluctantly. Good night, Rebecca. She paused at the door to her adjoining room, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Thank you, she said softly, for listening, for understanding. Always, he replied, and meant it. As Thomas prepared for bed in the quiet of his room, he realized that somewhere between obligation and understanding, between deception and truth, his arranged marriage had begun to transform into something he'd never expected, a partnership of equals, with the potential for genuine feeling. What remained to be seen was whether the fragile connection forged in Helena would survive the challenges that awaited them back at Raven's Crest, where Jackson Blackwell's influence cast a long shadow over their evolving relationship. The journey back to Raven's Crest passed in a different atmosphere than their trip to Helena, where before there had been polite distance and careful conversation, now a companionable ease settled between Thomas and Rebecca. They discussed what they'd accomplished at the governor's ball, the people they'd met, the future possibilities. For the ranch, and occasionally, when the road stretched empty before them, more personal matters. Rebecca spoke of her childhood in Stone Creek, of her mother's gentle influence before her untimely death, of her father's grief-hardened love. Thomas shared stories of his own youth, learning ranching from the ground up despite his father's wealth, his brief rebellion in Wyoming, his gradual acceptance of the responsibility that came with the Blackwell name. They were building bridges across the gap of their arranged beginning, finding common ground in unexpected places. By the time Raven's Crest appeared on the horizon, something fundamental had shifted between them. Not quite love, perhaps, but a foundation strong enough to build upon. Home at last, Thomas said as they approached the ranch house, the late afternoon sun gilding the weathered timber. Rebecca glanced at him, noting his choice of words. Yes, she agreed softly. Home. They were greeted by Mrs. Winters, who took their travel bags and informed them that Jackson was waiting in his study. He's been asking after you since noon, the housekeeper added, with a meaningful look at Thomas. Seems rather agitated about something. Thomas and Rebecca exchanged concerned glances. You should rest, he told her. I'll see what's troubling. My father. We'll go together, Rebecca countered, removing her traveling hat. Whatever it is, we'll face it as we did in Helena. Thomas felt a surge of appreciation for her resolute support. With a nod, he led the way to his father's study, where they found Jackson Blackwell pacing before the window, a telegram crumpled in his fist. There you are, he barked without preamble. Thought you'd be back yesterday. We stopped in Bozeman to meet with the bank manager as planned, Thomas replied evenly. What's happened? Jackson thrust the telegram at him. Northern Pacific is proposing a new spur line that would cut straight through our eastern grazing land. Surveyors were spotted on our property yesterday. Thomas scanned the telegram, a missive from a business associate in Helena warning of the railroad's expansion plans. This would divide our best summer pasture, he said, frowning. We'd lose access to nearly 3,000 acres unless they provide adequate crossings. "They won't," Jackson said grimly. "Not without a fight. I need you to ride out tomorrow with the foreman and a few men. Make it clear to any surveyors that they're trespassing on private property." Rebecca stepped forward, having read the telegram, over Thomas's shoulder. "If I may suggest an alternative approach—" "This is ranch business," Jackson interrupted sharply. "Best leave it to those who understand the stakes." Thomas stiffened at his father's dismissive tone, but Rebecca continued, unperturbed. "At the governor's ball, we met William Pearson, Northern Pacific's regional director," she said calmly. "He expressed interest in visiting Raven's Crest to discuss potential opportunities. Perhaps this situation presents an opening for negotiation, rather than confrontation," Jackson scowled. "Railroads don't negotiate unless forced. They take what they want unless shown they can't." "With respect, Mr. Blackwell, this particular railroad has considerable political influence," Rebecca persisted. "Commissioner Hayes specifically mentioned that the governor favors expansion of rail service through the territory. Fighting in the Northern Pacific directly could position Raven's Crest against the territorial administration." Thomas watched the exchange with growing admiration for Rebecca's poised reasoning. "She has a point, Father. A strategic approach might serve us better than an outright confrontation." Jackson's gaze swung between them, his expression darkening. "I see how it is. A few days in Helena, a few dances with politicians, and suddenly, my son thinks diplomacy trumps defending what's ours." He fixed Rebecca with a hard stare. "This is your influence, I take it." "This is a practical assessment of our options," Thomas interjected, before Rebecca could respond. "If we antagonize the railroad without exploring alternatives, we risk more than losing pasture land. Your grandfather built this ranch with a rifle in one hand and barbed wire in the other," Jackson growled. "Not with fancy words and political maneuverings." "Times change," Thomas said firmly. "The Montana Territory of 1892 isn't the same as when grandfather arrived. Legal battles and political alliances matter as much now as strength and determination did then." Father and son locked eyes in a silent contest of wills. Jackson Blackwell had always dominated such encounters through sheer force of personality. But this time, Thomas held his ground, his stance unwavering. After a long moment, Jackson turned away, his shoulders rigid with displeasure. "Do what you think best, then. But when your diplomatic approach fails, don't expect me to clean up the mess." "Mr. Blackwell," Rebecca said, her voice gentler now. "We're not suggesting abandoning defense of Raven's Crest's interests, only that we might achieve those interests through multiple strategies rather than a single approach." Jackson gave her a measuring look. "You speak well, Rebecca. I'll grant you that." He moved to his desk, seating himself heavily. "Invite your railroad man if you must, but I want our legal position clear before he sets foot on this property." "I'll ride to town tomorrow and telegraph Pearson," Thomas said, recognizing the grudging concession for what it was. "And I'll have our property boundaries verified with the land office." Jackson nodded curtly, turning his attention to the papers. On his desk, in clear dismissal, Thomas and Rebecca withdrew, closing the study door behind them. "That went better than I expected," Thomas murmured as they climbed the stairs to their rooms. "He respects strength," Rebecca observed, "even when it challenges his own views." "I've never stood up to him like that before," Thomas admitted, surprised by the realization. "Not about anything that mattered." Rebecca paused at the top of the stairs, studying his face with thoughtful eyes. "Perhaps you needed something worth standing for." The simple statement lingered in Thomas's mind long after they'd retired to their respective rooms. In the quiet darkness, he contemplated how much had changed in the weeks since Rebecca's arrival. He had begun viewing the ranch not just as an inheritance to preserve, but as a legacy to shape according to his own vision. He had found his voice, in opposition to his father's unyielding perspective, and most unexpectedly, he had discovered in his arranged wife a partner whose strengths complemented his own. The next morning brought clear skies and a sense of purpose. After breakfast, Thomas prepared to ride into Stone Creek to send the telegram to William Pearson. As he saddled his horse, Rebecca appeared in the stable doorway, dressed in her riding skirt and jacket. "I thought I might accompany you to town," she said. "There are a few supplies I'd like to purchase." Thomas smiled, pleased by the prospect of her company. "I'd welcome it." They rode side by side through the summer green landscape, discussing their strategy for approaching the northern Pacific. Rebecca's insights into the political considerations were astute, while Thomas contributed his deep knowledge of the ranch's needs and operations. By the time they reached Stone Creek, they had formulated a proposal that protected Raven's Crest's interests while acknowledging the railroad's expansion plans. After sending the telegram, they strolled along the town's main street, nodding to acquaintances and stopping occasionally to chat with merchants. Thomas noticed how easily Rebecca had integrated herself into the community, remembered names and family connections, inquired after businesses and children with genuine interest. Their last stop was the small building that served as Stone Creek's schoolhouse, a simple structure currently closed for the summer months. Rebecca paused before it, her expression contemplative. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, following her gaze. "About what you said in Helena," she replied. "About using this space for something more." She turned to him, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "The school term only runs 6 months of the year. The building stands empty the rest of the time." Thomas nodded encouragingly. "And you're imagining classes for adults, perhaps? Practical science for ranchers and farmers, soil composition, weather patterns, animal husbandry based on scientific principles rather than just tradition." Her words came faster now, animated by genuine passion. "Or lessons for children during the summer months. Not just reading and figures, but hands-on, learning about the natural world around them." Thomas found her enthusiasm infectious. "You'd teach them yourself?" "Initially, yes." She gestured toward the building. "It wouldn't require much. Some basic equipment, reference materials, specimens collected from around the territory. The school board would need to approve use of the building," Thomas mused, already considering the practicalities. "And there might be resistance to a woman teaching scientific subjects, which is why having the Blackwell name behind the initiative would matter," Rebecca said, watching his reaction carefully. "Your support would give the project legitimacy in many people's eyes." Thomas recognized the significance of what she was asking, not just his permission, but his active endorsement of her stepping into a public role beyond that of the rancher's wife. It would raise eyebrows, challenge conventions, potentially create conflict with his father and conservative elements in the community. Yet looking at the hope in her eyes, the intelligent passion she'd suppressed for propriety's sake, he found his decision already made. "I think it's an excellent idea," he said simply. "Raven's Crest will sponsor whatever you need to establish the program." Rebecca's expression bloomed with surprise and joy. "You mean that? Truly?" "Truly." Thomas took her hand, his own resolve strengthening. "You have gifts that shouldn't be hidden, Rebecca. If sharing your knowledge can benefit this community, I'd be a fool to stand in your way." She squeezed his hand, emotion making her voice slightly unsteady. "Thank you for understanding, for seeing me as more than just my wife," Thomas finished, his smile warm. "I think we both know you've been more than that from the beginning." Something shifted in her expression then, a softening, a lowering of defenses long maintained. Thomas felt himself drawn forward, closing the distance between them. In the shadow of the schoolhouse, with no audience but the Montana sky, he kissed her, not from obligation or convention, but from genuine feeling. Rebecca stilled for just a moment, surprised before responding, with a warmth that matched his own. When they drew apart, her eyes held a new light, a quiet wonder that echoed his own. "That wasn't part of our arrangement," she said softly. a smile playing on her lips. "No," Thomas agreed. "It's something better." Their ride back to Raven's Crest had a dreamlike quality, the landscape transformed by the subtle but profound shift in their relationship. They spoke of practical matters, the telegram to Northern Pacific, the supplies Rebecca had purchased, the approaching harvest season. But beneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of awareness, of possibility, of unspoken promise. The mood shattered upon their return to the ranch. A strange carriage stood in the yard, an elegant black landau with matched bay horses unlike any local conveyance. Thomas felt Rebecca tense beside him as they dismounted. "Professor Harrington," she said quietly, recognizing the vehicle. "What is he doing here?" They found out soon enough. Jackson Blackwell, Professor Harrington, and another man Thomas didn't recognize were gathered in the main parlor, their conversations ceasing abruptly when Thomas and Rebecca entered. "There she is," Harrington said, rising from his seat with a thin smile. "Mrs. Blackwell, or perhaps we should say the former Miss Sullivan." "Professor," Rebecca acknowledged coolly. "This is an unexpected visit." Jackson cleared his throat. "Professor Harrington and Mr. Davis here have brought some matters to my attention that I think require explanation." Thomas moved to stand beside Rebecca, keenly aware of the tension in her posture. "What matters would those be?" he asked, his voice deliberately even. The stranger, Davis, stepped forward, a folder tucked under his arm. He was a dour-looking man, with spectacles and the bearing of a clerk or secretary. "I represent the Board of Trustees of Everton Women's College," he announced. "We've been investigating certain incidents from Miss Sullivan's time at our institution." "My wife has been forthcoming about her experiences at Everton," Thomas stated firmly, "including the laboratory fire and its aftermath. Has she—" Harrington's eyebrows rose in feigned surprise. "Did she mention that the equipment used in the experiment that caused the fire was obtained without proper authorization, or that the procedure being conducted was explicitly forbidden by college regulations?" Rebecca paled, but held her ground. "It was advanced research, yes. Research that Professor Harrington himself encouraged until it proved more successful than anticipated." "A convenient interpretation," Harrington countered smoothly. "But the records show otherwise. The trustees have concluded that the incident resulted from your reckless disregard for safety protocols and unauthorized use of college resources." "That's absurd," Rebecca protested. "Mary Halstead and I had permission to use that laboratory. We were working on an approved research project." Davis removed a document from his folder, adjusting his spectacles. "According to our investigation, you falsified Professor Harrington's signature on requisition forms for dangerous chemicals, conducted experiments outside approved hours, and destroyed valuable college property through negligence." Thomas felt a surge of protective anger. "What exactly is your purpose in bringing these allegations here now, years after the incident?" Harrington smiled thinly. "Merely to set the record straight, Mr. Blackwell. When I encountered your wife in Helena, I was struck by the selective nature of her account of her time at Everton." He turned to Jackson. "I felt a man of your standing should know the full character of the woman who has joined your family." Jackson's expression was grave, his eyes moving between Rebecca and the visitors. "These are serious claims, Rebecca. Did you falsify documents, conduct unauthorized experiments?" Rebecca stood very still, her hands clasped tightly before her. "The research Mary and I were conducting showed remarkable promise. Professor Harrington initially supported our work, but when I refused his personal attention, that support was withdrawn. We continued our experiments because we believed in their scientific merit." "So you admit to circumventing proper channels?" Davis pressed. "I admit to pursuing knowledge, despite obstacles placed in our path," Rebecca replied steadily. The fire was a tragic accident, not the result of recklessness or negligence. Harrington turned to Thomas, his expression a study in false concern. I understand your marriage was arranged rather hastily, Mr. Blackwell. One wonders if you were fully informed of Miss Sullivan's history of deception and disregard for authority. Thomas felt rather than saw Rebecca flinch beside him. Something cold and hard formed in his chest. Not doubt in his wife, but rage at the calculated cruelty of this ambush. Let me be absolutely clear, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I am fully aware of my wife's history, her character, and her exceptional intellect. What I'm struggling to understand is why a professor from an Eastern college would travel thousands of miles to malign a former student to her family. Harrington blinked, momentarily thrown by the direct challenge. As I said, merely to ensure that she remains punished for rejecting your advances? Thomas finished, stepping forward. Or perhaps to prevent her from establishing herself here, where your influence can't reach. Davis looked startled, glancing between Thomas and Harrington with uncertainty. Professor, you didn't mention any personal conflict with Miss Sullivan. Because there was none, Harrington snapped. These are baseless accusations meant to distract from the documented evidence of misconduct. Jackson rose from his chair, his expression unreadable. Professor Harrington, Mr. Davis, I think I've heard enough for now. I'd like to speak with my son and daughter-in-law privately. Of course, Davis said quickly, replacing the document in his folder. We're staying at the hotel in Stone Creek, should you wish to discuss this matter further. As the visitors were shown out, a heavy silence descended on the parlor. Rebecca stood rigidly by the fireplace, her face composed, but her eyes revealing the strain of the confrontation. Thomas moved to her side, deliberately taking her hand in silent support. Jackson observed the gesture with narrowed eyes. Well, he said finally, it seems there's more to your past than you've shared, Rebecca. Not in any way that matters, Thomas interjected firmly. Jackson ignored him, focusing on Rebecca. I want the truth, all of it. Not the version you think will preserve your standing, but the facts as they occurred. Rebecca met his gaze directly. Professor Harrington is a man who believes women have no place in scientific research. When I demonstrated aptitude that threatened his views, he first attempted to cultivate my favor, and when that failed, to undermine my work. Her voice remained steady despite the difficult admission. Yes, Mary and I conducted experiments beyond what was officially sanctioned. We were discovering properties of phosphorus compounds that hadn't been documented before. And the fire, Jackson pressed, was an accident, Rebecca stated firmly, but one I've carried responsibility for every day since. Mary saved my life at great cost to herself. There is nothing Professor Harrington can say that would make me feel more guilt or regret than I already bear. Jackson studied her, his expression giving nothing away. Then his eyes shifted to Thomas's hand, still firmly clasping Rebecca's. Do you believe her account? Completely, Thomas said without hesitation, and I find it telling that this man waited until he saw us together at the governor's ball to pursue his vendetta. He observed something between us that troubled him. Perhaps the realization that Rebecca has found a place where her intelligence and character are valued rather than suppressed. A flicker of something passed across Jackson's weathered features, surprise perhaps at his son's vehement defense. He moved to the window, looking out at the ranch yard as he considered his response. Harrington strikes me as a man whose pride was wounded, he finally said, and wounded pride can fester into something ugly over time. He turned back to face them. However, the fact remains that you concealed significant details about your past, Rebecca. That concerns me. With respect, Mr. Blackwell, Rebecca replied, when you arranged this marriage, you weren't seeking a partner for your son, but a means to secure water rights and a suitable hostess for Raven's Crest. My academic history seemed irrelevant to those requirements. Jackson's eyebrows rose at her directness. Fair point, he conceded, though it seems your relationship has evolved beyond those initial parameters. His gaze moved meaningfully to their joined hands again. Thomas straightened, sensing the moment. Had come for honesty on all fronts. It has, he confirmed. What began as an arrangement has become something more genuine, something I value and intend to nurture. I see. Jackson returned to his chair, settling into it with the air of a man preparing for a lengthy discussion. And does this newfound attachment extend to supporting her in establishing some kind of scientific school in town? The telegraph operator mentioned you were inquiring about terms for using the schoolhouse. Thomas felt Rebecca's surprise in the slight tensing of her hand, but he kept his focus on his father. News travels fast in Stone Creek. Answer the question. Yes, Thomas said firmly. I believe Rebecca's knowledge and teaching ability would be valuable to this community. Raven's Crest will support the endeavor. Jackson leaned forward, his expression hardening. You'd have your wife teaching chemistry to ranchers and farm children, opening herself to ridicule and scandal, reinforcing whatever rumors Harrington might spread about her past. I'd have my wife use her considerable gifts as she sees fit, Thomas countered, and stand beside her against anyone who would demean or diminish her for doing so. Rebecca spoke up, her voice quiet but resolute. Mr. Blackwell, I understand your concerns. Truly I do, but I've spent years limiting myself out of fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of causing more harm. I can't continue to live half a life, especially now that I've found. She glanced at Thomas, genuine, emotion in her eyes, someone who believes I deserve more. Jackson studied them both for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Then, unexpectedly, a short laugh escaped him. Well, I'll be damned, he said, shaking his head. My pragmatic, dutiful son has gone and fallen in love with his arranged wife. Thomas felt heat rise in his face, but he didn't contradict his father. Instead, he met Rebecca's startled gaze, seeing in it a reflection of his own realization that what had grown between them, unexpected and unplanned, might indeed be love. Is that such a troubling development? Thomas asked, turning back to his father. Jackson rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Troubling? No. Surprising, certainly. He fixed Rebecca with an assessing gaze. You're not the woman I thought I was bringing into this family. You're considerably more complicated. I take that as a compliment, sir, Rebecca replied with the hint of a smile, as you should. Jackson rose, the decision apparently reached. Very well. If Thomas believes in you and your abilities, I won't stand in your way. Establish your school if you wish. But he raised a warning finger. You represent the Blackwell name now. Whatever you do reflects on this family and this ranch. I understand, Rebecca assured him, and I promise you my work will bring only credit to the Blackwell name. Jackson nodded curtly. As for Harrington and his accusations, if he continues to spread malicious claims, we'll address them directly. The Blackwells protect their own. The simple statement, their own, held profound meaning. Despite his reservations, despite the revelations and complications, Jackson had accepted Rebecca as part of the family, not just as a convenient addition or a means to secure property, but as a Blackwell. After Jackson had left them alone in the parlor, Thomas turned to Rebecca, taking both her hands in his. Are you all right? That was an ambush I never expected. I'm better than all right, she said, wondering in her voice. For years I've lived with the fear that my past would catch up to me, that when people knew the truth about Everton, they would see me differently. Her eyes searched his. But you didn't. I see you more clearly now, not differently, Thomas corrected gently. Your determination in the face of obstacles, your courage in pursuing what you believed in despite the risks, those qualities only make me admire you more." Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "When I agreed to marry you, I thought I was accepting a safe harbor, security and respectability in exchange for the water rights your father wanted. I never imagined I might find someone who would defend not just my reputation, but my dreams." Thomas raised a hand to her cheek, his touch reverent. "My father was right about one thing. This arrangement has become something neither of us anticipated." "Love?" Rebecca whispered, the word both question and realization. "Yes," Thomas answered simply. "I believe it is." He kissed her then, not with the tentative exploration of their moment outside the schoolhouse, but with the certainty of a man who had found his true partner. Rebecca responded in kind, her arms circling his neck as she yielded to the emotion that had grown between them despite all odds. When they finally drew apart, breathless and smiling, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "So, where do we go?" "From here, Professor Blackwell?" Rebecca laughed softly at the title. "Forward, I think, together." As evening settled over Raven's Crest, Thomas stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Rebecca joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cooling air. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, leaning against the railing beside him. "I was thinking about expectations," Thomas replied. "How rarely life gives us what we think we want, and how often it gives us what we truly need instead." Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. "When I stepped off that train wearing a veil, playing a role I thought necessary for self-preservation, I never imagined where it would lead. To a cattle baron who thought he was tricked into marrying an ugly woman," Thomas suggested with a wry smile. "No," Rebecca said softly, turning to face him fully. "To a good man who saw beyond appearances to the person beneath, who defended me not because of duty or obligation, but because he believed in me." She reached up, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I may have arrived under false pretenses, Thomas Blackwell, but everything since has been utterly true." Thomas caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Including this?" "Especially this," she whispered, and in her eyes he saw the future they would build together. A future neither had expected, but both now embraced with open hearts and clear eyes. Dawn broke over Raven's Crest with the promise of renewal. Thomas saddled 2 horses as the first golden rays touched the eastern ridge. Today would be significant, not because of any grand event, but because of a choice deliberately made. Rebecca emerged from the house, dressed in her riding clothes, hair braided simply down her back. No veils, no pretense, just the woman she truly was, ready to face the day. "Where are we going?" she asked, accepting the reins he offered. "Somewhere special," Thomas replied. "A place I've never shown anyone." They rode in companionable silence, climbing steadily through pine-scented forest before emerging onto a high plateau that commanded a breathtaking view of the entire valley. Below them stretched the full expanse of Raven's Crest, grasslands, creek beds, stands of timber, cattle grazing in distant pastures, the main house and outbuildings appearing small and geometric against the wild landscape. "It's magnificent," Rebecca breathed, dismounting to stand at the edge of the overlook. "My mother brought me here when I was 10, Thomas said, joining her. "She told me that to understand what you're responsible for, you need to see it whole, not just in pieces." He gestured toward the vast panorama. "This is Raven's Crest, as it truly is, not just property or assets, but a living part of the land." Rebecca understood the significance of him sharing this place. "Thank you for bringing me here. I wanted you to see what I see, he explained, now that we're truly building a life together. The morning light illuminated her face as she turned to him, emotions playing across her features. When I arrived here, I was hiding behind a veil, afraid to be seen for who I really was. I thought deception was necessary for self-preservation. And now, Thomas asked softly, now I understand that being truly seen is the greatest freedom. She took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. You saw me, Thomas. Not just my face when the veil came off, but who I am beneath all the layers I'd built to protect myself. Thomas nodded, understanding perfectly. And you saw me as more than just Jackson Blackwell's dutiful son. You challenged me to become my own man, to stand for what I believe in. They stood together at the precipice, the ranch spread below them like a map of possibilities. I received a letter from Mary Halstead yesterday, Rebecca said, after a moment of silence. I wrote to her after the confrontation with Professor Harrington, explaining everything. I wasn't sure she'd respond. But she did, Thomas prompted. Gently, Rebecca smiled, a weight visibly lifting from her shoulders. She did. She's married now, teaching chemistry to girls in Philadelphia. She never blamed me for what happened, Thomas. All these years, the guilt I carried. She shook her head in wonder. She asked me to forgive myself, as she had long ago forgiven me. Thomas squeezed her hand. Wise advice. She also asked about my work here, Rebecca continued. I told her about the science program we're establishing, how we hope to bring practical education to ranching families. Her eyes shone with purpose. She's sending some of her curriculum materials and experiment designs. From tragedy to collaboration, Thomas observed. You've come full circle. Rebecca nodded, emotion making her voice soft. With you beside me. Thomas turned to face the valley, his arm around Rebecca's waist. When my father arranged this marriage, he thought only of land and water rights. He never imagined what else might flow from his machinations. Like genuine partnership, Rebecca suggested. Like love, Thomas corrected gently. The word hung in the clear mountain air, authentic and unadorned. Rebecca leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. I have something for you, Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small, worn leather journal. This was my mother's. She recorded her observations about the ranch, the seasons, the plants and animals. She had a scientific mind, though she never called it that. Rebecca accepted the journal reverently. Thomas, this is precious. Are you certain? Absolutely. His eyes were warm with certainty. She would have admired you tremendously. Your courage, your intelligence, your determination to make a difference. Rebecca opened the journal carefully, finding pages filled with neat handwriting, sketches of plants, notes on weather patterns and livestock observations. This is extraordinary, a woman's scientific insights from decades ago. Perhaps the first volume in the library of your science program, Thomas suggested. A foundation to build upon. Rebecca looked up at him, her expression radiant with possibility. Our foundation. I love you, Rebecca, Thomas said simply, not because of our arrangement or obligation, but because of who you are and who I become when I'm with you. I love you too, she replied, the words no longer frightening or uncertain. Not despite. How we began, but perhaps because of it. We've built something real from an artificial beginning. As the sun climbed higher, they stood together on the ridge, two people who had started as strangers, bound by circumstance, and discovered something precious in each other. Below them, Raven's Crest awaited their return, not as owner and acquisition, but as equal partners with a shared vision. Ready to go home? Thomas asked, offering his hand. Rebecca took it without hesitation. Home, she agreed. Where we belong. They rode back down the mountain side by side, no longer separated by veils. or doubts or misunderstandings. What had begun as a ranch owner's reluctant marriage to a supposedly scarred woman had transformed into a love story written in their own terms. Honest, hard-won, and beautifully, imperfectly real. As Raven's Crest came into view, Rebecca turned to Thomas with a smile that held both past and future in its depths. "I believe this is the beginning of our true story," she said. Thomas nodded, his heart full. Not the end of a deception, but the start of a truth. And in that moment, both knew with absolute certainty that what they had found together was worth every difficult step of their unlikely journey. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.